We have the inimitable Dave Zirin with us today, and we were reminded as we spoke before this that Dave launched our Nation Conversation series April 1, 2020. And we're so thrilled to have him back. I just want to say, we've lived through a lot in these last months. The Chauvin verdict last week, it's hard to believe last week, election, Trump no longer tweeting his way to winning the news every morning, and Biden being moved by movements to do things we may not have suspected, certainly at home. And tonight is not the State of the Union because it's coming later, but an address to the nation. And I just wanted to single out, I think what's exciting is that the human infrastructure piece tonight is very much based on what Ai-jen Poo, who was a guest in this conversation series, spoke to us about. Childcare, universal childcare, a caring economy. And I think that some of the thinkers we have in our nation community are really influencing this administration through the movements they have engendered over this last decade. I also want to call out that the Working Families Party response tonight will be Jamal Bowman, who joined us months ago as he was running for Congress. And he is someone who spoke so eloquently about bringing money to the Bronx and not to weapons overseas. And he was a high school principal and spoke eloquently about education. He is now playing an important role in Congress. So it's a chance to meet people. I don't think Dave's heading to Congress, but it's a chance to meet people whose ideas inspire the change in this nation. And I'm very proud of the nation's role in that sense of movements leading to both movement change, transformative change, and electoral change. So we have with us someone who's written more books than I can count. I think it's 10 or 11, but he's our sports editor. And I've said to him many times, I'm very proud to have been the first editor to have brought on a sports editor. He hosts the Nation's Edge of Sports podcast, and he now writes a column at MSNBC, where he's also a regular guest, and his writing has appeared in too many places: the New York Times, Vibe, the LA Times, the Baltimore Sun. His forthcoming book, I think, is a major book, and I know Dave will talk to us about it, The Kaepernick Effect. It comes out in September, and it features riveting, inspiring firsthand reporting that Dave has done in these tough times, and firsthand stories of how taking a knee triggered an awakening in sports, and includes interviews with professional athletes across the board. So we will do more with that book, but it's a great contribution, not just to the sports world, but the sports world, as Dave has revealed to us, intersects with gender, race, class, in every arena. And it's a way people come into the subject. His most recent article, The Tokyo Olympics Are Terrible, he's beginning to do some reporting while dealing with his kids' school schedule. Anyway, I want to introduce and welcome Dave Zirin, who's going to talk to us for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up. I know there's some cruisers on the Zoom. Dave has been a regular, and people, I remember Dave said, sports? You bringing on a sports editor? And then they didn't want you to leave. They didn't want to part with you at the end of the cruise. So welcome, Dave.
Oh, it's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Katrina. It was an honor to do this in April 2020,
Wow.
below the many years ago. And it's an honor to do this today. I can't believe April 2020 was only a year ago. There's some quote by Oscar Wilde about his time in prison where he says, every day felt like a year, and this year the days were long. That's how sometimes I feel about the last year. But it's such a thrill to be here, and to be introduced by Katrina is a thrill unto itself. I wish I could tell my 20-year-old self that was going to happen, and I would have said, no way, buddy. So let's talk some sports. As just to frame this conversation, I just want to make it clear that I love sports, love to play, love to watch, and love to coach, which I do now with my 13-year-old son. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s. I was a sports obsessive. I was a fan of players with names like Darryl Strawberry, Keith Hernandez, Lawrence Taylor. I had no idea at the time that all of my heroes were heavily into recreational drugs, but hey, that was the 1980s for you. I never gave much thought to the politics of sports until the 1990s, when there was a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul Rauf who made the decision that he wasn't going to stand for the national anthem while playing for the Denver Nuggets. He was going to stay in the locker room instead. And I remember watching reports about that. And I would always tune in every day to ESPN Sports Center at 7 p.m. to find out the latest with Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, the latest about his battle against the politics of patriotism and militarism. And I'll never forget, one of the talking heads on ESPN said that Rauf must see himself in the tradition of athlete activists like Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, or Billie Jean King. And I remember hearing that and my mind just going like this, like athlete activists. What the heck is that? Never heard of such a thing. I know athletes hitting home runs, scoring touchdowns, but never heard of an athlete activist. So, in these days before the internet, I couldn't exactly Google athlete activists. So instead, I went to the library, got deep into the microfilm and microfiche, not just the film, but the fiche. And I studied sports history and sports sociology. And I studied and I spoke to elders and I read amazing books about people like Muhammad Ali. There's a great book called Redemption Song, Muhammad Ali in the Spirit of the 1960s by Mike Marquesi that absolutely changed my life. Just reading about the way he contextualized Ali as part of his times. And one of the things I learned in reading all of this sports history is that from practically the beginning of organized sports in the United States, and we're going back 150 years, there was a contradiction baked right into the cake. And that's the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. And I want to say that again. Baked into the cake of organized sports in the United States is the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. I want to explain what that means. On the one hand, when sports was first launched as an organized entity for profit in the 19th century, it was marketed as patriotism, as the best possible expression of the United States, because anyone, if they were good enough, could take the field and succeed. That's what sports was, and that's where we get that phrase, the level playing field, because that's what sports is. It's a meritocracy, and if you're good enough, you can play. But on the other hand, there was this thing called reality, and there was not a level playing field. If you were a woman, no sports for you. If you were black or brown, you could form your own leagues or don't play at all, but stay out of our sight. But as black and brown folks, as indigenous folks, and as women began in the 19th century and into the 20th century, as they began to fight for access to sports, they immediately made it a contested space, a space where athletes' demands for access and equity became a political struggle all its own. The battle to level the unlevel playing field has made sports a political space from the very beginning. Or you could argue the second that Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, was told that he actually was not going to be allowed to fight for the heavyweight title, from that moment on, sports became a contested space. So from the very beginning, the very platform of sports becomes a space for more than just fun and games. It becomes this contested space where the battle rages between the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion. It also becomes a political platform for things that have nothing to do with sports. It becomes a platform from the very beginning for franchise owners and league commissioners to express their beliefs, often which have revolved around not only exclusion, not only on issues of what we're really talking about is white supremacy, white male supremacy, but also their brand of patriotism, their brand of militarism, and their brand of corporate rule. It also almost immediately became a platform for athletes to not only fight for access to play, but also to express dissent with the way things are, not just in the sports world, but in the real world. Sports became a platform used by athletes to speak out, not just about the sports world, but about the real world. And this is why we can't think of the civil rights movement without thinking about Jackie Robinson, or the 1960s without Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, or John Carlos, who raised their fists on the 1968 200-meter medal stand, or the women's liberation struggles of the 1970s without Billie Jean King, or the fact that the first Special Olympics were in what year? 1968. That wasn't an accident, because the Special Olympics came out of the struggles in the 1960s around people with disabilities demanding to be seen, demanding to be heard, and demanding to play, demanding for that very elusive inclusion that sports has always held out but pulled away. And today, we see a very similar echo of those struggles, the struggles of women, Black and brown folks, people with disabilities. We see the struggle for access by LGBTQ people, most specifically trans athletes, transgender athletes. And I think it's very important to recognize that struggle for access continues, that struggle for the right to take the field continues, because the bashing and the demonization of young trans athletes has become, along with the curbing of the right to vote, basically the entire program of the GOP. And of course, to fast forward to today, just like it's impossible to imagine the civil rights movement without thinking of and speaking about Jackie Robinson, it's impossible to imagine the Black Lives Matter movement of the last decade without thinking about that image of Colin Kaepernick first sitting and then taking that fateful knee in August of 2016. Now, and this is where we get to my book, which is called The Kaepernick Effect and is out this September. Why did Colin Kaepernick have a particular resonance? Why will we remember Colin Kaepernick for years and decades to come? Why will we remember that simple and very humble act of first sitting behind all the other players on the sideline during the anthem and then taking a knee? That very humble act became a lightning rod, and it became something that people gravitated towards. Why is that the case? Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, but to just name a couple, and this is what I really discovered in working on this book. And before I give the reasons why Colin Kaepernick resonated, just to be clear, I interviewed like over 100 young athletes from junior high to the pros about why they took a knee during the anthem in their hometowns, in small towns in Texas, in big cities in the Pacific Northwest, in New York, in Michigan, in California. Why did these athletes make the choice to take a knee during the anthem? And why did Kaepernick resonate with them? Why was that the example for them? I mean, one reason why Kaepernick resonated, of course, is what I already mentioned. There was a movement in the streets willing to support and connect with him. Colin Kaepernick did this in August of 2016, right after the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. So there was a context with when Kaepernick took that knee, which is very different, for example, than the player I mentioned earlier, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, who didn't come out for the anthem in the 1990s with an absence of a movement around him. He did it as a lone actor. And so I think it has been lost to history what Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf did, while what Kaepernick did immediately resonated because he was symbolizing what was becoming a mass movement. The second reason why Kaepernick has resonated, of course, is that the NFL, the National Football League, is the closest thing to a national religion we have in this country. And Colin Kaepernick was a quarterback who'd taken his team to the Super Bowl. You know, it doesn't get much more high profile than that in the world of sports. And that's a reason why he also became a punching bag for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump never hesitating to use Colin Kaepernick as a way to actually, I think, build racism and resentment among his core base and to speak to the lizard brain of his followers as a way to get them as angry as possible, which is, by the way, a very old trick in the racist playbook, is to demonize Black athletes. Well, Donald Trump was proudly standing in that tradition. Another reason why Colin Kaepernick resonated is that by taking that knee during the space of the anthem, he was also taking on, whether consciously or not, the hyper-patriotism of the National Football League and turning it on its head. I mean, make no mistake about it, Colin Kaepernick was not protesting the flag. He was not protesting the anthem. What he was protesting was police violence and racial inequity. What he was protesting was the gap between what we're told the anthem stands for and the reality of the lived experiences of Black Americans. But the NFL, since 9/11, as Howard Bryant wrote so brilliantly in his book, The Heritage, had become a staging ground for hyper-patriotism and militarism. The League had literally become an arm of the Pentagon in its support and for the war on terror. And I mean literally an arm of the Pentagon. Like there's a financial relationship that existed between the Pentagon and the National Football League. And Colin Kaepernick, by taking this politicized space and saying, well, I'm going to use it for this, turned it into a much grander deal than it would have been if he'd, say, done it, I would argue, before the 9/11 era. And the last reason why I think what Colin Kaepernick did has had such resonance, and this is what my book is about, is that it's a gesture that allowed for replication. Look at what he did. He went out to play. He takes a knee during the anthem, something any athlete could do. Maybe you couldn't be an NFL quarterback. Maybe you couldn't speak in front of 50,000 people at a march on Washington, but you dang sure could wear your uniform and take a knee. And I interviewed dozens of athletes from all over the country about why, and I asked them this basic question: why did you take a knee? Why did you do it? And what I found out was really fascinating, because there are some common threads that I learned in talking to folks 20, even 25 years younger, even 30 years younger than I am, or the people that I was interviewing. And I learned, first of all, that these young athlete activists didn't do it just because Colin Kaepernick did it. They were not copycats following a trend. They did it because there had been police violence in their own communities, or in some cases, their own families, or they were absolutely fed up by the viral videos that were showing up in their social media feeds, and they just felt like they had to do something. And when Colin Kaepernick took that knee, they saw someone who provided for them a language for protest and dissent as athletes. So what Colin Kaepernick offered was not, hey, you can be like me, Colin Kaepernick. What he offered was a lexicon, was a language by which they could also protest police violence. And Colin Kaepernick also demonstrated that the space of the athletic field, far from being this apolitical space, was a contested political space. And it was a place that could be claimed for a community protest. Not just the athletes on the field taking a knee, but people in the stands taking a knee in solidarity, or people in the stands, in some cases, physically defending the athletes from other people in the stands who wanted to physically harm them for taking a knee. And I think it's not surprising that the athletic field, I mean, what it really has become over the last several years since Kaepernick took that knee, is almost like a political space of last resort. Because in our hollowed out cities and small towns where there is an absolute war against public space, the athletic field is one of the last community spaces where people gather, and nature abhors a vacuum. We see that's one of the great lessons of history. So people come out and be political at the game precisely because of an absence of other spaces in our modern society where everything is privatized within an inch of its life. And then lastly, talking to the people, I think what I'm going to say is not going to shock, I think, a lot of people on this call, but I think it's so important to say this young generation of folks, and I mean people between the ages of, say, 15 and 25, they have suffered a generational trauma in growing up in the times in which they live, in a post 9/11 era where they know nothing but surveillance, in a post Columbine era where they know nothing but being over policed. And they also suffered a generational trauma in a way that I frankly didn't understand until doing this book, with the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman in Sanford, Florida. Trayvon Martin, for this young generation, he is their Emmett Till. Like literally almost every person I talked to, and I spoke to 100 folks, they all mentioned Trayvon Martin. And if you remember the story of Emmett Till, obviously they didn't have social media back then, but what they did have was Mamie Till, a teacher, and Emmett Till's mother, making sure that his casket was open after he was lynched and murdered in the South. And the photos of Emmett Till's horrifically disfigured face were in Jet magazine and were broadcast all over the world. And that really caused a generational trauma that affected everybody from young civil rights activists to a young man in Louisville, Kentucky named Cassius Clay, who later became Muhammad Ali. It was a life-changing thing to see Emmett Till. And similarly, it was a life-changing thing for these young people to live through the killing of Trayvon Martin. Now, I started this book right after the pandemic started. It was during the pandemic last spring, and I got to be honest with you, my motivation was super humble. And I'll just end on this point. I know I've been going on for a minute. My motivation was to call people who took a knee. You know, I looked them up online, I looked up articles, and then just found people through social media, did a little detective work, found phone numbers, called people up, interviewed them. And I only did it because I felt like, and this is spring of 2020 we're talking about, I felt like their stories were in danger of being forgotten. I felt like all these people had taken a knee after Kaepernick in 2016, and already we were forgetting about this athletic resistance. Already it was becoming something that had been thrown down the memory hole. And so I wanted to tell their stories. That was my sole motivation. Obviously, I did not foresee the police murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. And I did not foresee that last summer would become the largest number of demonstrations, not just for racial justice, but for anything in the history of the United States. That was last summer. And of course, during those demonstrations, you saw it explode gigantically in the world of sports. You saw entire teams taking a knee. You saw protesters taking a knee. Heck, you even saw police officers in some places trying to appropriate the gesture and taking a knee to show the demonstrators, hey, we're on your side. And then of course you had the brutal contrast, which people made this point on signs, banners, t-shirts, where you have Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, and then the juxtaposition of Derek Chauvin taking his own kind of knee and taking the life of George Floyd. So this idea of the taking of the knee, I think, is one of the most important, powerful gestures of our time. And I think by understanding it, we also get a heck of a window as to where this young generation, a generation that I would argue is more protest ready and less tolerant of intolerance than perhaps any generation in the history of the United States, you get an insight into where they are and where I think they're going by this very simple and humble gesture of taking a knee. And you could also understand why it seems to upset all the right people, because what they're calling for is not peace, but justice. And that's all I got. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the nation.
Thank you, Dave. Peace, justice. Thank you for that brilliant analysis of the resonance of the taking of a knee, that pure, humble gesture, which has become so resonant for everyone, including the generation you spoke of, and reminding us of the myth of inclusion and the reality of exclusion, which could be applied to contested arenas of life, politics. I wanted to ask you there are a lot of great questions, so let me just ask you one. Where do you see the movement for equity in sports going? What are the upcoming flashpoints, and what gives you most hope? That's a lot, and I'm going to leave the hope one for Aaron at the end. But the movement for equity, flashpoints ahead.
I think we've got so many flashpoints in front of us precisely because the wine is out of the bottle. This young generation of athletes, because of their access to social media and their ability to connect with people directly, and because of the presence of this movement and the presence of so much dissatisfaction in not only their own lives, but in the lives of their families. I mean, I think we're at a point where everything is on the table. And I think you had a particular flashpoint last August after the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I wrote about this extensively for the Nation because I thought it was so important and critical, when you had league after league of players going on strike and actually withdrawing their labor in protest of the police shooting. It was the introduction of labor into the Black Lives Matter movement in a way we really hadn't seen, save perhaps from the teachers in the broader labor movement. And so it was very, very powerful. And I think the idea of athletes recognizing their own strength is something we're just going to see more of as we go on. As for me personally, as far as what I'm looking at in terms of the flashpoints, in addition to the development of the Black Lives Matter movement and the world of sports, I think something I mentioned earlier about the defense of transgender athletes is going to become extremely important. for people who see themselves on the left or see themselves as part of any sort of resistance struggle. I mean, for the basic reason that they're being absolutely ruthlessly scapegoated with a whole host of wrong information, but that has very serious human repercussions. And I think that is going to have to be something that people in the sports world, that people don't leave off to say, oh, well, that's a political issue. But no, that's actually a sports issue, because it's the same old story about access and who says who has the right to play and who doesn't. Is play a right or is play a privilege? I think it raises all of those questions in a very strong way. Also, the issue of women's unequal pay. We saw this with the NCAA this past year, and the idea of even the most basic equity between women and men athletes is an extremely hot button issue right now. And then lastly, obviously there's no shortage of things to write about. Lastly, the intersection of the pandemic and global events like the Olympics and the World Cup. How do we make them safe? How do we make them speak to the best angels of our nature and not the worst? Currently, right now in Tokyo, I would argue they are speaking to the worst. The overwhelming majority of people in Tokyo don't want to stage the games. They do think it's too dangerous. And I think as sports writers, we have to cover that aspect of it, or we're doing it a disservice. And frankly, I got to say, the hope question is just the mere fact that we're having this conversation. Because we could have had this same conversation 15 years ago, and I would have been like looking through the straw for needles to think about issues that we could talk about. And now there's this sense of being overwhelmed, not just by the sheer tonnage of politics in sports, but also by the politics of possibility that this can change.
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to turn this over to Erin, who has many questions.
Yes, we do have a lot of questions. Thank you, Katrina. I want to start off, Dave, with just a comment from Elizabeth Tanner, which she's in our chat, and I think it speaks to the power of your work. Elizabeth Tanner is building a sociology of sports unit for a high school class, and is attending today as part of that pursuit. And I think that that's incredible. We have, well, sorry, lots of questions. Excuse me that I just lost my.
Can I throw in something real quick, Erin?
Yeah.
I have found, my experience has been from both teaching at the community college level and speaking at high schools, that sports is a brilliant way to teach young people about race, class, gender, sexuality, even for people who aren't sports fans. It's not exclusionary to people who don't care about sports. What it is an interesting window with real human characters and real dramas that tell serious political stories. And so I'm just excited to hear that kind of class is being developed, and I'm hearing more about that around the country.
That's amazing. Thank you. Jay Coakley asks, how does the US stack up with athlete activism compared to other countries? Is the US a leader? Has activism become a norm worldwide among athletes?
Oh, the great Jay Coakley, I'm honored. Sincerely, honored. Just to say that I think one of the things that was very interesting is that the United States isn't always at the front of movements for social justice, not merely talking about sports, but it is in so many respects the trendsetter for what happens in other countries. So you see people throughout the English Premier League, for example, and in other soccer leagues as well, taking a knee as a matter of course. You've seen other footballers or soccer players say in very political fashion that they're not taking a knee because they feel like it's performative. And they feel like it's not something that that is actually doing anything, and it's merely to act as a kind of whitewashing, if you will, of the league itself, because the league isn't doing nearly enough to fight, say, racism in soccer, for example. And so it's led to just a tremendous amount of discussion in other leagues about what does it actually mean to fight racism as a league? What does it mean to fight racism as a business? What does it mean for players to have independence from the league itself? And that is something I think you're seeing around the globe. Similarly, when women in the United States fight for equal pay, particularly in the world of soccer, that has a ripple effect globally as well. So there's a lot happening on the global scene. I'm much less of a an expert on it, but what I am seeing are these stories coming from all four corners of the globe at this point. And the most important thing that I think is getting replicated is something that certainly has existed historically, but is much sharper now. And that's the idea of seeing the field as a contested political space.
Thank you. We have several questions about paying college athletes. Michelle Willens asks, any thoughts about paying college athletes when their coaches get millions? And then we have some concern about paying athletes. Jim Anderson says, I'm struggling paying college or even high school athletes. Where does it stop? Can we get money out of school-based sports?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. First, two points on this. First, the critique about college athletics goes back 100 years. I mean, Upton Sinclair was writing about it in the 1930s. So this is an old argument, this idea that college athletes should be treated like the campus employees that they are, given that they're generating income for the school itself. So that's one thing, that this is not a new discussion. But what is new is the sheer tonnage of money that's in the NCAA sports system, in the revenue-producing sports of football and men's basketball. One statistic I like throwing out because it's a good one for people to use and repeat is the current coach of Clemson, a guy named Dabo Swinney. He makes $10 million a year. That's Clemson University. Clemson University won the national championship in 1981, and their coach was a guy named Danny Ford. Danny Ford made 50 grand. Now, how does a job that made 50 grand in 1981 become a $10 million a year job in 2020? That has everything to do with cable television, broadcast money, and billions of dollars in revenue that's entered the system. And yet the position of the athlete is incredibly similar to what it was in 1981. Even recent movements to get name, image, and likeness rights for athletes, their right to just be able to do a TV commercial or be on a box of cereal, that's something that the NCAA said recently that they would look into, but now they're dragging their feet on it in a very obnoxious way. Meanwhile, the head of the NCAA, Mark Emmert, who just got his contract extended to 2025, makes $4 million a year. And the NCAA is ostensibly a nonprofit. So to me, when you look at the reality of things, I think that these college athletes in the revenue-producing sports should be paid like the campus employees that they are. And the coaches themselves, in their salaries, you can see that the system has the money to be able to do this and not hurt other sports, which is often what people with the NCAA like to say.
Thank you. From Chuck Carlson, the proposal of a wealth-based European soccer super league earlier this month highlighted the fact that the MLS in the United States operates as that failed proposal was to operate. Do you think there's any possibility of that promotion and relegation based on sporting success as opposed to money would ever happen in the US soccer major leagues? And Michelle also asked, what did those 2 days of secret billionaire meetings tell us?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the first one's easy to answer. I don't think you'd ever see relegation in U.S. sports because U.S. sports has so effectively built a tradition on cartels, basically these closed profit entities that, teams aren't going anywhere. They're certainly not going to go to any minor leagues. The billionaires who run these teams would never allow it. Although as somebody who was raised a Mets and a Jets fan, I've often wondered why relegation does not in fact exist, and maybe that could provide a motivator that does not otherwise exist. But those fateful 48 hours where you thought there would be a super league, I thought it showed us a couple of big things. There are a couple of big lessons. The first is that, we live in quite the populist moment right now. And one of the things driving the populist moment is that there is a huge gap in terms of outlook and understanding between the billionaire class and everybody else. So the billionaires who are putting together the Super League, and by the way, what a stupid name, the Super League. I was thinking, did a 10-year-old come up with that? So they actually thought this would be a great idea that would be embraced by all. Their early statements were, our fans are demanding this. And yet what it produced instead was a fan revolt. it produced this combination of rebellion and revulsion. I mean, in the middle of a pandemic, fans in the streets demonstrating, protesting. And I heard some people say, and this is very fair, wow, if only people would be that upset about racism, think about what we could do. And there's truth to that. But I also think it would be wrong to dismiss the protests and resistance that took place as saying, well, that's about sports because it doesn't mean anything. No, it's about how out of touch these billionaires actually were. I mean, JP Morgan issued an apology for being one of the bankrollers of the Super League. I don't think JP Morgan apologized when they had to write a check for $13 billion after the 2008 financial crisis, yet they apologized for the Super League. I mean, it just gives you an idea of how much anger was generated and the potential, if we had a functioning, strong left, not just here, of course, but in Europe, to actually take that anger and actually direct it towards other struggles that we believe in.
Thank you. A question from John Murphy. Can you comment on the theme behind the movie High Flying Bird?
Wow. Asking me a question about a 2018 film on Netflix that I'm guessing a lot of folks have not seen. I loved High Flying Bird. I really did. People should go to Netflix and watch it. And watch it, especially for you sports history folks. The last scene is one of the best, for me, like one of the best last scenes ever. And it doesn't end with a championship, and it doesn't end with some sweaty person saying, "Yo, Adrian, we did it!" Like no, it ends with something much cooler than that, and I'm not going to give it away. I think that the themes of High Flying Bird, that sports is built around a kind of exploitation and corruption, unless you actually seize control of yourself as an athlete and begin to use the tools that sports provides, like the platform that it provides, the fame that it provides, and use that for what you believe in. Then you're going to just become chum. You're going to become grist for the great shark that is sports. Like either you feed on the shark or the shark feeds on you. I felt like that was the message of High Flying Bird, and I recommend people seeing it. And I'm only sad I can't give away the ending. That doesn't seem fair.
No, I haven't seen it, but I'm going to watch it now.
Oh yeah.
Jordan Weltman wonders, could you talk about the collusion of NFL owners in keeping Kaepernick out of the league? How has it happened?
Well, it's happened because of that word you described, collusion, which is against the collective bargaining agreement. And it's something that simply, there's no place for it in sports. I mean, remember the meritocracy idea. If you're good enough, you should be able to play. The whole Colin Kaepernick saga shows that meritocracy is absolutely bogus when it actually hits in the face of billionaires who are worried, one, about offending the right-wing fans, white fans, and two, offending themselves and their own families. Because what you have here also is, if you look at like where money goes from NFL franchise owners, this isn't going to shock anybody, but they tend to be extremely conservative. They gave millions of dollars to Donald Trump, and they weren't going to have a quarterback use their platform because that's how they view it. They view it as their space that players are just lucky to be a part of. They're not going to have them use that to speak about police violence and police brutality. And I think a lot of it speaks to also the way NFL franchise owners view players, which is as disposable pieces of equipment. I mean, you can't have the concussion scandal that you've had in the NFL without realizing that they don't view the players necessarily as human, that they view them, like I said, as extensions of equipment. And I think that I think that's what made Colin Kaepernick so threatening to them too, which is another reason why he's being pushed away. Like, because he wasn't just speaking about police violence, he was representing the idea of athletes actually using their power of the platform itself. And in the NBA, they've seen this and decided to try to embrace it and work with it and say, okay, you're right. People don't pay to watch NBA Commissioner Adam Silver sit and watch a game. They're watching LeBron James. And if LeBron wants to say something, then LeBron wants to say something. But the NFL ownership, they just could not abide by that. But what I think is so interesting, and this is one of the things I learned in writing this book, The Kaepernick Effect, out in September, what I learned was that for so many of these players, Colin Kaepernick is like this animating spirit, and they view him as somebody, as a hero. Colin Kaepernick's 5 years ago, remember. So if you have like a 17-year-old athlete, that means from ages 12 to 17, they're viewing Colin Kaepernick as a hero, and then it's their turn to decide whether or not to take a knee, and they do it. That's really important in that he's become like this spirit, because what I've found is that oftentimes when athletes are pushed out of sports for being political, they're used as a ghost story. Like saying, hey, you don't want to end up like Mahmoud Abdul Rauf. You better stand and you better be careful. You better listen to what the boss man says and you do the right thing. And they wanted that for Colin Kaepernick. They wanted him to become a cautionary tale. And instead, he became something quite different.
Thank you. The Peace Action from New York State asks, how should we respond to the partnership between the US military and law enforcement and major sports leagues?
First of all, I believe I'm doing a keynote for the Peace Action of New York State when they're giving an award. That just happened last week. They asked me. I was so honored because you don't usually get sports writers asked to speak to Peace Action. And I don't want to call it a telemarketer, but I was a fundraiser for Peace Action out of college. So that's pretty cool that I'm going to speak.
That is pretty cool.
For Peace Action. I'll be like, I used to make phone calls for you. And I was proud to do it. Now, I think people should protest it. I think it's abhorrent when sports leagues use our love of sports as a way to build support for militarism and policing. And we should demand that our sports be a la carte from politics that we disagree with. I mean, it's not just the other side that gets to say, keep politics out of sports. We can absolutely turn that mirror on to them and say, hey, oh, you want to keep politics out of sports? Well, then let's keep some of what you're proposing out of sports as well, in terms of militarism, hyper-patriotism, pro-policing rhetoric, and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm a big believer that you can't keep politics out of sports, so you might as well throw the door open and have it be this open, contested space and let the chips fall where they may. But you can't have a situation where one side is saying, keep politics out of sports, while at the same time pushing a political agenda.
Thank you. This is a question from Steve Nesich. Is there any evidence that the boycott of Major League Baseball that Trump and his followers called for after the All-Star game was moved from Atlanta to Denver is actually working? Also, was it just a coincidence that Colorado has, along with Washington State, arguably the most fair and accurate voting system in the country and 100% mail and drop box voting?
Second part, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I think Major League Baseball thought long and hard about where to move the game to, because they knew wherever they moved it to, it wouldn't be perfect. And the right wing would say, oh, and they tried this with Denver. It was so silly where they said, oh, you're moving it to Denver, Colorado. Well, Denver, Colorado requires voter ID. How's that different from Georgia? And it's like, Denver, Colorado has also never had a line waiting to vote ever since they adopted mail-in voting, and Georgia's adopting the most Jim Crow 2.0 laws we've seen in this country since the horrific days of the pre-civil rights era. So Major League Baseball had to choose very carefully when they chose Denver. I don't think it was coincidental at all. But on the first question, there is zero evidence that ratings are down because of the call to boycott Major League Baseball. Zero. I study this stuff. Get out of here. Major League Baseball is fine, doing just fine financially. The bigger issue for Major League Baseball, and it's a profoundly bigger issue than Republicans who are had their feelings hurt, and it's frankly connected to the reason why they moved the All-Star game in the first place, is that they desperately need younger fans. The average Major League Baseball fan is 57. Now, there's nothing wrong with being 57, but they want to be able to have people in their teens loving this sport. And there's a whole department now of Major League Baseball that's trying to figure out how to make the games more interesting, how to make them more exciting, how to make them faster. And you've seen rule changes this coming year, during this year, as part of this experimentation to make the game more viewer friendly, specifically for younger fans. And I think that's a huge reason why Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game out of Georgia, is that they did not want Brian Kemp in the backdrop when they celebrated people like Henry Aaron, who just passed away, or Jackie Robinson, I mean, they knew that that just would not fly because, as I said in my talk, I believe that this young generation is just more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation we've ever had in the history of the United States. And Brian Kemp's Georgia just was not going to cut it.
Thank you. Tony Kelso would love to hear more about your take on the influence of LeBron James in politics.
Oh, it's interesting. I think LeBron James' influence begins in 2012 after the killing of Trayvon Martin. It was LeBron James and Dwayne Wade. And I remember writing about this for The Nation like it was yesterday. I can't believe it was 9 years ago, when they decided to pose the entire team for a photo while all wearing hoodies. The hoodie being representative of Trayvon Martin, because that was a justification given for his murder, the idea that he was suspicious for wearing a hoodie. Now, that photo of the Miami Heat wearing a hoodie, it became really the first viral sports politics photo. The first time social media had really been leveraged to speak about issues like anti-racism, and using social media to do it. And I think that accomplished two things. One, it opened up this idea of power to athletes, and this idea of saying, wow, we actually have access to the public to not just speak about, oh, drink the right soft drink or whatever, but a different kind of politics that social media could be leveraged to use. The other thing is that because LeBron James is LeBron James, by speaking out, it created a kind of force field effect where other players said, well, if he's speaking out, then I can too. And you can't punish me unless you're going to punish LeBron James. And you're never going to punish LeBron James because he's basically like a Fortune 500 company, a global corporation unto himself. So there is no punishing LeBron. And if you're not going to punish LeBron, you can't punish the guy at the end of the bench who really cares about a particular issue or another. So I think LeBron James has been, even though I certainly don't agree with everything he's ever said or whatever, but we don't have to agree with everything he says. That's not the point. The point is much more that he created space for other people to speak out, and he showed people how social media could be leveraged. So his contribution is gigantic.
Thank you. Denise Young thanks you for the terrific talk.
Oh, thanks.
And asks, do you see ways that unions that represent professional athletes could play a more defined and advanced role in representing these athletes and the social justice issues that players are advancing?
Yes. And you're starting to, unions at their best are representations of the will of their members. Far too often, we don't necessarily see that, but you're starting to see signs of that in sports. Before Major League Baseball decided they were going to move the All-Star game, which, by the way, they were right to do, moving it out of Georgia and taking it to Denver. Before they did that, it was the head of Major League Baseball Players Association, Tony Clark, a former Major League player, who did a press conference where he just sort of said cryptically that people were talking about it and that this was something the union wanted to take up. Major League Baseball acted very quickly after that. And I'm not sure you would have seen the union do that in years past. Certainly in the NBA, the union has tried to be a facilitator for players who want to speak out or do issues that relate to social justice, anti-racism. The union has tried to actually act as a conduit for players to be active. And in the NFL Players Association, I mean, this is a very tough space for the players union in the NFL, precisely because the league has non-guaranteed contracts, and it can be very brutal on the players themselves. And the players have such a short window in which they can make and earn their money. But I think you're going to be seeing this in the NFL Players Association as well. I think it's very important.
I have a couple comments, I guess, on the cost of going to a live game and what you think the future might hold. Susan Segal writes, pre-pandemic, the tickets had already become prohibitively expensive for most people to attend live games. And Tim Morgan asks, do you think the cost of sports, ticket prices for fans, will go down based on COVID-19 and teams trying to get fans back into arenas and stadiums?
Yes, no question, costs will go down, but not out of the goodness of the hearts of franchise owners. It's really because for most leagues, actually with Major League Baseball being an exception, tickets are not necessarily how money's being made. I mean, it used to be you had to put a good product on the field and you had to make the tickets affordable, not because the franchise owners of the 50s and 60s were so much nicer, but because that's how their bottom line profits were actually made. But today it's made through public financing of stadiums and sweetheart cable deals. That's where the fundamental money is made. The NFL just signed contracts with networks worth up to $100 billion. They don't need fans in the seats, but they got to have them because, first of all, it's a better product when you have fans. It's a better product when you have fans. I mean, we're scenery at this point, but we psych up the players by being out there, where we're very TV friendly by yelling and screaming and doing all the rest of it. So we're still important, but we're not as financially important as we used to be. So I actually, and that connects to the last part of the question, I actually expect ticket prices to go down because they do want people back in the arenas themselves. And I think we all experienced this last year as sports tried to stay afloat, is that it was an odd experience watching sports without fans. It was almost, and sports viewership went down pretty dramatically during the pandemic. And Marist, which did polling about this, when they looked deeper into the issue about why fans weren't watching sports, because you had people on the right say, "Oh, it's because sports is too political and fans are tuning out." That's complete horse feathers. That's just not true. When they looked into it more closely, it was because of the pandemic. Is that it just felt too weird to watch sports, and sports watching is one of our few communal experiences in this country. You go to a bar, you go to a friend's house, or you go to a game, and taking that away for a lot of people made sports actually too painful to watch. And they want that to change.
Great. So Miguel says hello and
hello.
asks, do you see Olympic athletes protesting at the games this summer, if the games are played, like John Carlos and Tommy Smith did in 1968?
I'm sure Miguel knows this, but that's a very timely question because the International Olympic Committee just reiterated what they call Rule 50, which is a rule that prohibits protest at the Olympics. And they were doing it as a real shot across the bow against the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, which really changed their tune this year and said, we support athletes who use that space to make a political stand. We recognize that athletes are the ones who created that space, and we defend their right to do it. And the IOC went, oh, hell to the no. No, this is not happening. And, I'm glad the IOC said it's not happening, because I believe that if you want protests to be effective, it actually has to involve risk, and it has to involve resistance and rebellion. And no athlete should ask the IOC's permission to protest. I repeat that. No athlete should ask the IOC's permission to protest. And the IOC shouldn't see itself as an entity that grants permission for protests. So I'm actually fine with what the IOC did, and I do think athletes are still going to protest. They may pay a price for it, but John Carlos and Tommy Smith, they paid a price as well. That's part of doing this work, tragically, but it is. It's the burden and the blessing of the activist athlete.
Thank you. A question from Ann W. How do you respond to football great Jim Brown's critique that this is a workplace with rules, etc.?
I wrote a whole book about Jim Brown called Last Man Standing, a whole political biography of Jim Brown. And, I fundamentally disagree with him about this. If someone asked you to stand for the national anthem at your workplace, you'd be well within your rights to say no. This is the workplace for the athlete. They have the right, as someone who lives under this Constitution, to say whether or not they're going to in fact do that. And Jim Brown, this is very consistent with his politics over the course of his entire life, which are very complicated and very contradictory. And I recommend check out my book about it called Last Man Standing, about Jim Brown's very complicated and very tortured legacy.
Maybe you can share, who are some of the most interesting or influential athlete activists that people could keep their eye on, maybe some people that aren't extremely well known?
So it'd be easy to say people like Megan Rapinoe, who I interviewed for the Kaepernick Effect and talked about her experience taking a knee. But I would just keep a close eye on people like Andrea Yearwood, who's a trans athlete from Connecticut, because I think that struggle is going to be so tantamount. And similarly, Chris Mosier, he's a brilliant trans athlete who I interviewed for the Nation's Edge of Sports podcast. I think that keeping an eye out on some of these NCAA athletes who are starting to challenge the NCAA's rules and using hashtags like not NCAA property are people we want to look out for as well. And, a player who I think is just going to lead in the years ahead, who's certainly very well known, but it's an all-star player for the Boston Celtics named Jaylen Brown, who's been so impressive throughout this last year of protest. And it excites me every time Jaylen Brown decides he wants to speak. The first thing he said after the elections was that not having Trump in office could create a situation where people basically go to sleep and stop protesting, and that can't happen. And so like his first instinct after Biden was elected was not, yay, we did it, but well, the struggle has to continue. And so I'm very excited about where that's going to go because he's still a very young player.
Thanks, Will. So I usually wrap up with a question of hope, but you already gave us that.
Hopeful we're having this conversation.
Yeah. And you know what? I always feel hopeful after I talk to you.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I appreciate it very much.
And I don't know if you have any last remarks for the community, and Katrina will come back on and maybe ask a final question or close.
I would just say, when you look at how politicized the sports world is right now, we do well to remember the words of Ralph Nader, who once said, "You better turn on to politics or politics will turn on you." It would be very wise to turn on to sports, or sports will turn on you.
Thank you.
What a close, Dave. I want to thank you for this extraordinary, fascinating talk, which if we needed reminding, you remind us that sports is a window onto the issues of politics of all kinds, sexuality, race, justice. Also very moving about the younger generation. I mean, the generational traumas and intolerance, less tolerance, far less for intolerance. Why we have a high school class on this call, why we hope to have more high school students reading The Nation, reading you. Wanted to just remind everyone to listen to your Peace Action talk. I think there were people from Peace Action who didn't know you were speaking, but also to read your book and come to The Nation to read you. You are phenomenal. And thinking of what you said, I wanted to tell people we have next week Chase Strangio and Raquel Willis speaking about transgender youth and the struggle for transgender youth rights. And the following week, we have Monica Ramirez speaking about migrant women and the struggle for rights in these times. And Dave, just to speak to you, no peace without justice. And we could listen to you for a long, long time. And I know we'll put some of this on the site, but really grateful to remind us. I think back to the sports issues we did together too. We may have to revive
the sports issue.
Sports, and I will close. You mentioned Ralph Nader. I think Nader once said, if people would bring their passion that they bring to sports radio, to political radio, we'd be a stronger country for it.
Right.
But you remind us that sports and politics are inseparable. So thank you so much, Dave. And thanks to everyone on the call. Thanks to Aaron and Peter Rothberg and Gia and Sarah. And thank you, Dave, for being part of the Nation family.
I'm honored to be a part of the Nation family. And I'm also so excited for next week because I had Chase Strangio on the Nation Edge of Sports podcast as well. And Chase is absolutely one of the sharpest knives in any box he happens to be in. And
Raquel Willis, we did TV on election eve, and terrific. Anyway.
Wow.
So thank you. And thank you, participants. Look out for an email from us about, we're not doing a cruise this year, but we may do something on land and hope to lure Dave to come speak.
I miss everybody, so I really hope so. Please invite me.